And hello everyone, welcome back to a new video. Alright, so today we will be talking about memory usage in data types such as integers and reals. Now occasionally, let's say you are building a game. Let's put it into a little world. You are a game developer and you want to make a really big game. But this game, it should be able to run on lower end devices as well, and not just a freaking massive gaming PC. It should be able to run on as many places as possible. Now, you don't want to use huge containers like variables, containers, to keep your data in. So let's say you want to store a number from 1 to 10. You don't want to use something that's going to take about, let's say, 10 bytes of memory, which is not a lot, but over time, the more you have of this amount of memory, the more it will take. So let's go here and open up a Paint tab. Let me just show you a very basic example. Let's say this is your RAM stick, and let's say this is about 10 bytes. And this 10 bytes is one integer, let's say that. Now imagine there is about, let's see, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There's about 9 spaces where you can fit this int in, which means you can only have about 9 integers here. This is a very basic example. Do not take this too literally. And let's say you want to develop a game for this very weak PC. Now, if you're going to use an integer to store all of your values, then each time you're going to create a new integer, it's going to use up more space and more space and more space until there is no more space left. And then the PC is just going to start running extremely slow because there is no more place to put a new integer. There's no spots here where integers can fit, because each one of these can only hold one integer, only one integer variable, because this takes 10 bytes. So yeah, that's just something to keep in mind. Now note a real integer doesn't really take 10 bytes. But this is actually valid in a lot of programming languages. This right here, where integer takes a little bit amount of space more than something else would. Now I'm not going to open up Delphi because this isn't really necessary, but you can go do this on Delphi and you will get a result. So let's start with a byte. Let's say you want to store that number from 1 to 10. You do not want to store more than that. And you have to save as much storage or as much RAM as possible, because this is going to be a massive game and you're going to have hundreds upon hundreds of variables that's going to be called constantly. So you need something very small. So then you decide you're going to put it into an integer. But then you realize this integer can keep numbers from negative 2 billion 183,648, all the way up to 2,147,483,647. And that's a large number it can hold. And this takes literally 4 bytes. So this is the actual amount of space this integer will take. To just keep a number between 1 and 10, it takes 4 bytes. Now if you compare it back here, and let's say instead of 10, this was 4. It's still going to take a lot. It's still going to very quickly just fill up the RAM. And remember, part of this RAM is being used for the operating system. So you're only allowed to use about this amount, and you need to make this as small as possible. So what do? You use a byte. So you can go, if you create a byte between 1 and 10, and you make it of type type byte, this can keep everything from 0 all the way to 255, and this only takes, as the name suggests, 1 byte of memory. And that is actually a big thing, because now you're saving 3 bytes of memory just because you used something smaller. Now, just something to say, if you're learning this for school, this isn't that important. You do not need to know things like bytes, shortints, words, small ints. You don't really need to know these things. You actually just need to know integers and int64, which we'll get to later on. But let's continue. So then you can store between 0 and 255. But let's say you want to store a value now between -10 and 10. But you can't, because a byte can only hold between 0 and 55. If you're going to go into Delphi, you're going to say b is a byte. And byte. And then you go begin, and here inside of your thing, you go b becomes -1. This will give you an error, because this is invalid. A byte is not allowed to go below 0 or above 255. Some languages will take the value, let's say it's -1, and then it will go back to 255. It will reverse. But in Delphi's case, if you say -1 or 256, it's going to throw an error, because this is not allowed in Delphi. That is why you have something called a shortint. Now this shortint, which also only takes about 1 byte, this can store literally from -127 all the way to 127. So now you can go below 0, but only until 127 below 0 and 127 above 0. But let's say you don't want to do this anymore. Now you are going to store, let's say, someone's money, and you need to store this guy's amount of money he has all the way up to 50,000. What are you going to do then? Let's make it a little bit smaller. Let's make it 30,000. So you want to store his 30,000 coins he made inside of the game, but you don't want to use unnecessary amounts of storage in the RAM, which will just clog up the memory. So the next thing you can use is a word. Now this word can store, or uses 2 bytes. Little bit more than a shortint and a byte, but it still uses only half the amount of bytes that an integer does. Now this word, even though it says word, it's not actually word. Remember, it's an integer. You can store numbers in here. Now this word can store anywhere from up to 0 to 65,535. That's a big number. So this can be the max amount of, let's say, gold your character can get. And that's very nice. But let's say you don't want the character to have more than 30,000 gold, but they should also be able to go into debt up to 30,000 gold. Now, this is where you get a small int. A small int uses 2 bytes, and it stores anywhere from -32,768 all the way up to 32,767. So now you can put them in debt. So now we have the coins. We can store coins and the random number. Now let's say we get a little bit more complex. Let's say the character's attack ability can be extremely strong. The character's most maximum powerful attack should be 4 billion. 4 billion in damage. And that is the most the character can attack with. If it hits something with 4 billion, it will reduce its HP to half. Let's say that. Now, you don't want to use an integer because you think using integer is not good. But in this case, this uses 4 bytes. So you can actually store this into an integer. But the problem is, an integer can only go up to 2 billion, as you can see right here. It cannot go up to 4 billion. So your second option would be to use a long word. Now this long word can store up anywhere from 0 or 4 billion, 294,967,295. That is how much a long word can store. So if you don't want to store it inside an integer because an integer is too small, you can use something such as a long word. Now a long word, oh damn, my O's, I don't know why I always make them capital. Now a long word is exactly as a cardinal. A cardinal can store exactly the same amount here. And a cardinal also only takes 4 bytes. So you can use either a long word or a cardinal to store your value. And let's get to integers. Now you have an integer. We've already explained the integer. I can store anywhere from 2 billion, negative 2 billion to plus 2 billion, you know. Now an integer is also the same as a longint. A longint can store the exact same amount for the exact same cost as an integer. So if you don't want to use an integer, you can use a longint instead. Because a longint and an integer is basically the same thing. Just like a long word and a cardinal is basically the same thing. And now here, let's say that you are creating the very final boss for your game, and this boss should be the most powerful thing you have ever seen in any game possible. No game that has ever existed should be able to defeat this boss in amount of HP. This boss should be super full of HP. It should take the character at least 3 days to defeat this guy. But the character can already attack up to 4 billion in damage. How are we going to pass that? Well, that is where the int 64 comes in. Now this is for data types, or this is more for 64-bit computers. As soon as you use this, I don't know if it will actually work on a 32-bit computer. I've never actually tested it out on a 32-bit computer, but this uses a 34-bit data type, and this uses a whopping 8 bytes, double the amount of an integer. But even with those 8 bytes, it gives you a massive boost. Now I don't know how to say this number because it is huge. It is extremely huge. So I'm just going to type it out. This right here, this is the number that an int64 can store. Hundreds, thousands, millions. It can go over 1 billion, trillion, think gazillion, I don't know, and quadrillion maybe, I have no idea. but it can store a huge amount. And this, let's say this is the boss's HP. Now this will take the player easily up to 3 days to defeat, even with his most strongest attack ability. Now this, of course, should just be used for very special occasions. Only when the max amount of numbers is going to go over 4 billion. That's the only time you should use this, if the amount that's going to be displayed is going to go over 4 billion. Because this is going to use a lot of RAM, and it's going to slow down the PC, depending on how fast it is, quite a bit. If you're going to make all of your integer variables in 64, you're going to use a lot of RAM, and it's going to just destroy the poor computer. But this is just something to note. You do not need to know this if you're in school. Except for this one, you do need to know this one. If you ever get a huge number and you're not able to store that huge number in something as small as an integer or a long word, then you can use an int64. But for the rest, if you're going to go professionally into Delphi or any other programming language, you should know there are quite often different things for different amount of memory. For example, in Java, just an example, you have an integer, and this integer, let's say, is the same as Delphi, and this only takes 4 bytes. Then you have a long, and this takes 8 bytes. And then you have a long, and this will take, let's say, 16 bytes. I have no idea. But as you can see, this actually exists. This right here actually exists in different programming languages that uses types. So something like JavaScript might actually have something like this, but languages like Java, C++, C, I guess C#, I don't really know, they will have things like this. And if you're making games with those languages, knowing things like how much storage or how much memory in bytes something uses, and if you really need to use this variable type like an integer to store a small number between 1 and 10, where you can just put that in a byte. See, it's that was quite a lot to take in, but I think we can actually take a break. Now, there is more we can do in terms of real values, but I think just telling you guys about the integers is enough. I don't think you guys need to know about any of the other types like reals and stuff like that. I just want to show you guys that there are different types that can store different things, but they are the same type. They all store numbers. They're all integers, but they're different types of integers, and I just want you guys to know that. I hope you all enjoyed. Thank you all for watching, and see you all